This time bringing you 5 of my favorite subclasses in Baldur's Gate 3. Recently, I took a look at some of the ones I avoid, and just generally didn't like that much, so naturally, on the other end of that spectrum, I thought I would talk about the ones that are my favorites. That said, many of these are my favorites because they sort of meet in the middle in terms of both roleplay and general effectiveness. So while I wouldn't really consider any of these the best of the best in terms of options or combat effectiveness, many of them are quite good, simply because that is just a fun way to play many of the times, but also try to roll in some of the class fantasy to each individual approach I take to these, especially in a game like Baldur's Gate 3, where the emphasis is very much so on the role-playing itself, and not so much min-maxing, which largely isn't necessary. So to kick this video off, we will start with the simple and straightforward option, which is the Battlemaster Fighter. One of the simpler classes to play, period, and then the Battlemaster Fighter, while it does add a little bit of variety with its combat maneuvers, manages to facilitate a lot of battlefield control while still being a very simple build. You're basically just trying to hit things in the face. Battlemaster Fighter is so good that it is one of a few subclasses or classes that I will just play as a pure class. I won't try to multi-class it with anything because largely it is unnecessary. Battlemaster Fighter is very, very strong all on its own, thanks to features such as the fighter's action surge ability, their natural tankiness, their high chance to hit, which is all improved upon largely by the superiority dice and combat maneuver mechanics of the Battlemaster Fighter. Basically, this subclass works by granting you superiority dice. These are essentially a class resource that you can spend on performing various maneuvers. You pick a few as you level, and while the list they have in-game is pretty good, it's actually not the entire list available to them in the tabletop version. And these maneuvers consist of things like making an attack and pushing an enemy back, attempting to disarm them when you attack them, tripping them and knocking them prone, just to name a few of the more basic ones. And because you spend a superiority dice on these, you actually get extra damage on top of it as well. And then as you level up later, it goes from like D8 dice to D10s, potentially increasing that damage even more. So the reason I like Battlemaster Fighter so much is because it is simple but very, very effective. You can be really tanky, you can do fantastic damage as the fighter in general is one of the most reliable damage dealers in the game, and you can lock enemies down while you're at it, which all makes for a subclass that is both easy to play while still being brutally effective. Second up on this list, however, we have the College of Swords Bard, a real jack-of-all-trades character that is capable of supporting your party via spells like all of your low-level ritual spells that will allow you to buff your party for the day via Long Strider, things like that, without using spell slots, being able to boost their own abilities in and out of combat via Bardic Inspiration, while also still managing to be an incredible damage dealer. And while this is already a really good subclass in the TTRPG, the gear in Baldur's Gate 3 really pushes this thing to the next level, especially if you do a little bit of multi-classing with it to give it a few more options. You can easily turn this into one of your best damage dealers. And this is largely down to the College of Swords ability known as Flourish. Basically, you can convert your Bardic Inspiration resource, which is normally used to buff allies, into a resource for an attack that deals an extra effect of some kind. This can be the ability to attack more than one target, an attack that grants you a bunch of extra AC to provide you some survivability, or even pushing an enemy back like 20 feet and then teleporting to them, that kind of thing. And that's on top of the subclass itself granting your bard things like medium armor, and thanks to their charisma caster status, they also make a really good face character. So the reason I like this particular subclass so much is because it really does let you do just a little bit of everything. You can be a very effective caster, you can be fantastic in melee or ranged combat, as the flourishes will typically work with ranged attacks as well, and you can do all the talking if you want to. So anytime I use this class, I am effectively buffing my entire party with it, passing all of the skill checks, and still easily pushing out over 100 damage a turn. But like I said, some of the gear available in Baldur's Gate 3 in particular is what really sells this, as the way they implemented hand crossbows in particular can really give you some incredible range damage and is usually the better option, as the melee flourish in particular actually requires you to have 2 separate targets, whereas the slashing flourish for the ranged attack will let you attack the same target twice. which can be more effective. And if you were to, say, combine that with like a Thief Rogue multi-class, you have a Bard that is making 6 attacks per turn, while also easily regenerating their Bardic Inspiration on a short rest, which they get an extra one because the Bard has the Song of Rest feature, which effectively just gives you a short rest in this game, on top of the 2 you already get. Really, the only downside to this subclass is that it takes a few levels to get going. The early game, like levels 1 through 5, are a bit slow, but after that point, you just start destroying everything. And thanks to all those abilities, in and outside of combat, this is just an incredibly fun way to play the game, because you can just do so much with a single character. That brings us to number 3, however, and this is the Tempest Cleric. A pretty popular choice here. I wouldn't say this one is much of a surprise, but Tempest Cleric is my favorite cleric subclass in particular because it gives me the spell list that I want. While it does have some really great subclass features like the ability to maximize thunder or lightning damage at the cost of your channel divinity resource, or use your reaction to deal lightning or thunder damage to something that hits you, for instance, on top of the already great cleric stuff like Turn Undead, which comes up a lot in this game. Truth be told, the reason I personally really love this is because of its great spell list. Clerics, based on their domain, get a bunch of extra always prepared spells relating to the domain they are, and Tempest gets a lot of my favorites, such as Call Lightning, Ice Storm, Insect Swarm, on top of all their already really great cleric spellcasting. And if that wasn't enough, as many people are also aware, it also is a really great multi-class for a lot of other classes, because of the way this game handles lightning damage. Basically, if anything is wet, it takes double damage from that. And because Tempest Cleric has an ability to literally maximize the roll on lightning damage, you can combine those things to deal some just insane damage, like literally hundreds to multiple targets in a single turn. And while that isn't personally why I really enjoy it so much, it is definitely worth a mention. But Tempest Cleric is actually what I used for my first run through Tactician mode, the game's hardest difficulty, and it was a ton of fun. So much so that these days I pretty much always have a Tempest Cleric in my party. I often respec Shadowheart into one as an example. And while there are other cleric subclasses that I think are really fun on their own as well, I think War is actually good on its own. Nature actually makes a lot of sense because then you can make use of Shillelagh and focus entirely on Wisdom as a cleric to make your attacks with, which can be helpful, just to name some examples. But nonetheless, Tempest Cleric is very much so my favorite. I really do enjoy that one. Though that does bring us to number 4, and this is your run-of-the-mill evocation wizard. In many ways, kind of what I consider the default wizard. Wizards focusing on evocation specifically allows them to not damage other party members with their evocation spells, which means you can do things like cast your fireball, use Ice Storm, etc. without hitting your own party. And because I often like to run melee-oriented party members that are often right up next to the enemy while laying down huge AoEs with the spellcaster, having a wizard that won't actively kill my own party members while I do that is extremely useful. And that, combined with the wizard's natural spellcasting ability, makes them a bit of a powerhouse. Even if it isn't quite as fun as a sorcerer's meta magic, I admit. However, while I really do like that ability just on its own, it's actually not the reason that this is my favorite. That honor goes to their 10th level ability called Empowered Evocation, which allows them to add their intelligence modifier, or their spellcasting ability, to the damage rolls of their evocation spells, which means that your spells that make multiple damage rolls are now suddenly doing twice as much damage. Things like Magic Missile or Scorching Ray can be used to just delete enemies once you hit that level, and both of those things just kind of really dial into the way I enjoy playing a wizard, hurling spells, not worrying about hitting my own people, and also doing just ridiculous damage with all sorts of very destructive abilities. And this, combined with a lot of the really great casting gear you can get in this game, things that will restore your spell slots, let you cast without using a spell slot, gear that increases your spell save DC, which means area of effect attacks like Fireball are even more likely to actually deal their full damage, all make for another simple but effective way to play a caster that allows you to not have to worry about things like positioning, toggling certain abilities, or anything like that. You just point and click, basically, and things just get deleted off the screen. It's a fun way to play that kind of archetype, which is typically referred to as a blaster caster, and while many people prefer a sorcerer for this, because thanks to their meta magic, they can usually deal more damage. This just really is almost tailor-made for how I like to play these, which is why it's my favorite. That does, however, bring us to our final entry. And I did save this one for last because it truly is my favorite subclass in the game, because it uses my favorite class in 5th edition D&D, which is the Warlock, and more specifically, the Great Old One Warlock. Now, I've said many times in many places, 5th edition D&D is hardly my favorite tabletop rule set or system at play in a CRPG. It's not bad. It's very popular for a reason. It's easy to get into. There's still a lot of choice and ways for people new to it to approach things. However, one thing I do think that Dungeons & Dragons really nailed is a lot of the lore and world building, which is why there's so much stuff to pull from across its many different settings. But of all of those things, probably my favorite thing that they've done is the Warlock, because it is such a fun intersection between interesting abilities and class flavor. Because while I would argue that while the Warlock has a lot of unique things, such as their pact magic, what really makes them all the more interesting for me is the stories and accompanying fantasy that you can tack on to the abilities themselves via the interaction between you and the patron giving you these powers in some way. And of those, I really like the Great Old One. My actual favorite, like many people, is the Hexblade, but that's not in Baldur's Gate 3, and before that we had the Great Old One, which is to say our Warlock entered into a pact with a cosmic eldritch horror of some sort, and is now getting power from it. And one of my favorite things about that subclass is that due to their nature as an unknowable cosmic entity, Great Old Ones are very open-ended in terms of roleplay. In fact, in the case of this particular subclass, the Great Old One in question might not even be aware that it's granting you these powers. It might just be some sort of subconscious effect of its cosmic nature. Because what a Great Old One wants is supposed to be incomprehensible to us mere mortals. So why and to what end they would enter into a pact with anyone, if they even did it on purpose, is wildly up to interpretation. So where things like the Fiend Warlock are a little more straightforward, the Fiend is after your soul and is giving you power in exchange for that in most cases. And given the psychic nature of these entities as well, that fits right in with the Mind Flayer-oriented campaign in Baldur's Gate 3. So, needless to say, there's just a ton of roleplay potential there, which is actually why it is my favorite. Though, in general, Warlock has always been my favorite class, but I think all of that suits this campaign really, really well. And that's before we even start talking about the mechanics that I think make a Warlock really fun to play. But in the case of the Great Old One specifically, we get an ability that is going to allow us to potentially make enemies miss by imposing disadvantage when they try to hit you. And then later at 10th level, they actually pick up resistance to psychic damage. That in a game, again, with Mind Flayers comes up a lot. So that resistance is pretty handy to have. So while the Great Old One Warlock and Warlocks in general are hardly on their own like the best possible choice, there's a lot of fun multi-classes you can do with them though. The reason I enjoy it so much is, again, it's just kind of the perfect meeting point for me between both the class fantasy at play and what is going on in this individual campaign, on top of just generally fun mechanics to mess around with, which is why it is at the top of my favorite subclasses. That, though, is going to do it for this video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Let me know down below all about your favorite subclasses, of course. I'm very curious to hear what everyone is enjoying now that the game has been out for a while. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have